go back to our question from YashaYahu, Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 1. And but we're picking up now in chapter 3 for context, right? So bear with me while I get that back on the screen. So to answer chapter 4 and verse 1, to get the contextual answer concerning chapter 4 and verse 1, is it saying that it's okay for these men to run around and have themselves many wives and live off of our women? Is that what Yahuwah's word is saying? So, YashaYahu, Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1. For look, the sovereign Yahuwah of hosts is turning aside from Jerusalem and from Yehudah the stock and the store. He's drying up their supplies and their store and their surpluses, all the supply of bread and all the supply of water. Okay, so I'd ask the question, what do we learn from this? From verse 1, and I believe somebody had rightfully responded that this is saying that a famine is coming. This is saying that a famine is coming. Okay, famine and destruction. That's right. Famine and destruction. Okay. Now, family, when Yahuwah brings famine, is it because he is pleased with his people, or is it that he is chastising his people because of some bad behavior, because of disobedience, right? He's chastising, right? He's chastising. Okay, so herein lies the first clue concerning what's really being said when we get a little bit further down in Yahuwah's letter to his people, in his word to his people. All right, now verse 2 says, the mighty man and the man of battle, the judge and the prophet, and nobody is excluded, and the diviner, right? That's the medium, that's them who are mingling with the dead. And the elder, the commander of 50, and the highly respected man, and the counselor, and the skilled craftsman, and the clever enchanter. And I shall make youths their heads, and children shall rule over them. Microphone is open, family. If you would just check your mics for me. There is a microphone open somewhere. Tada. Okay. I will cause children to rule over them. And the people shall exert pressure, man on his neighbor, the young rise up against the older, and the lightly esteemed against the highly esteemed. When a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father by the garment, and say, come, be a chief over us, and let this ruin be under your hand, he shall swear in that day, saying, I am not a healer, for in my house is neither bread nor garment. Do not make me a chief of the people. You see, there will be no real order, is what Yahuwah is saying. There's going to be famine. There's going to be disrespect. There's not going to be any kind of order, right? Chaos is about to come upon you, is what he's saying. For Jerusalem, verse 8, has stumbled. For Jerusalem has stumbled, and Yehudah has fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against Yahuwah, to provoke the eyes of his esteem. The look on their faces witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Saddam. They do not hide it. Woe to their being, for they have brought evil upon themselves. Say to the set apart, it is well, for they eat the fruit of their doings. My people, youths exert pressure on them, and women rule over them. O my people, your leaders lead you astray. and swallow the way of your paths. Still happening right now today. Yahuah shall stand up to plead and is standing to judge the peoples. Yahuah enters into judgment with the elders of his people and its heads. It is you who have eaten up the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? Declares the sovereign Yahuah of hosts. And Yahuah says, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks and seductive eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a jingling with their feet. Therefore Yahuah shall smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and Yahuah expose their nakedness. In that day, Yahuah takes away the finery of the anklets and the headbands and the crescents. Okay, so crescents there, this is something pagan that they were doing. The pendants and the bracelets and the veils, the headdresses and the leg ornaments and the sashes and the perfume bottles and the amulets, the rings and the nose jewels. Right? Now he said that in that day he's going to take away all of these things. In what day? In what day, family? In that day. In what day would that be? Are you still having static, Akut, Vernice? So he says, in that day, this is what he's going to bring against the women of YashaYahu. In that day. In what day? Remember in verse 1, end times as in the judgment, the time of judgment, right? So remember in verse 1, Yahuah says he's going to bring a famine upon them. So in the day of their judgment, in that day of famine, in that day of judgment, this is what I'm going to do to the women. Okay? So we're already seeing context established. We're already seeing context established. And what's happening? And what's happening is that so context is being established. So what's happening is that the people are under judgment. Yahuah is displeased with the people. And so he's bringing some things against the people. He's bringing it against the prophets. He's bringing it against the teachers. He's bringing it against the government. He's bringing it against the women. He's bringing it against the children. He's bringing it against YashaYahu. He's bringing judgment against YashaYahu. So the context here is not that Yahuah is pleased with his people, right? It's that Yahuah is displeased with his people. The context here is that there is no order in the land, but there is disorder. There is dysfunction in the land, right? That's the context here. So keep that in mind now as we continue, family, because what these false teachers out there are teaching, they're preying on our women. They're using chapter 4 and verse 1 to prey on our women when it's saying the totally opposite of what they are saying that is saying. These are men who are working, who are seeking to satisfy their own lust, these men, you see. And they're using Yahuah's word to do it. And for them, that's unfortunate, you see. That's unfortunate for them. Now, it says, let me go on now. No, verse 22, the costly robes and the cloaks and the shawls and the purses, the mirrors and the fine linen and the turbans and the large veils. And it shall be, instead of a sweet fragrance, a smell of decay. And instead of a belt, a rope, lynched. And instead of a well-set hair, baldness. And instead of a festal robe, a girding of sackcloth. And branding. You remember that video we watched at the beginning? How when they took us as slaves, how they branded us? And branding instead of loveliness. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your strength in battle. And their gates shall lament and mourn, and she deserted shall sit on the ground. The condition of the woman of YashaYahu. Her men will be destroyed. The women of YashaYahu, husbands, men will be destroyed. and she will lament. She will weep on the ground because the men will be, they will be destroyed. They will be lynched. They will be beaten. They will be brutally treated. That's what happens when judgment come upon YashaYahu, right? Chapter 4 now, just simply a continuation. And in that day, in what day? Here it is again, in that day. In what day, family? We're looking for the answers. We want context to tell us, but I want to make sure that I'm not making it up. In what day, family? What day do you gather? In the day of famine. In the day of judgment. You see? In the day of famine. In the day of judgment. Right? In that day, when Yahuwah's wrath come upon his people, this is what's going to happen. And in that day, in the day of judgment, 7 women shall take hold of one man. Why? Because men will be scarce. Most of them will be locked up in jail. A lot of them will be killed. You see, that's according to the scriptures. Read further on in YashaYahu chapter 44. It says that they are locked up in holes. They're locked up in prison houses. You see, they're being killed. They're being lynched. They're being shot down by the police, by the slave hunters. You see. And in that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we shall eat our own food and wear our own clothes. What they're saying is, listen, you don't need to worry about taking care of us. The role here has been reversed. You don't need to worry about being our provider. We will be your provider. Just agree to being my husband. Do you know that that's literally happening today? Literally, we're living it. You go on Facebook and you look at these groups. These women are begging men, just be my husband. You see, and vice versa. The men ain't begging. They're just proclaiming. And the women are gladly jumping on. You see, don't worry, we'll take care of you. It's happening. You see, Yahuwah says it would happen. In every day of judgment, it happens. You see, and that's what's happening. That's the context of Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 1. It is not what, you know what's amazing? These liars, lying prophets, lying teachers, these predators, that's what they are, these predators, preying on our women. They're using these scriptures, ripping them out of context to fulfill the lust of their own flesh, to fulfill the desires of their own flesh, their wicked, deceiving, deceitful desires. You see, the context tells us that it's not what they're using it, but amazingly, there are many of them out there doing it. Amazingly, there are many of them out there doing it, and people are falling for it. You see, unfortunately. And so he says, we shall eat the women say, we will eat our own food. We'll be our own, we'll provide. We'll go to work. We'll take care of you. We'll take care of the house. Just be my husband. And I don't care if it's 7 of us. I don't care if it's 5 of us. I don't care if it's 3 of us. I don't care how many of us. Just be my husband. Only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach. Because you see, it would come a time in this judgment that the women would feel shameful of not having a spouse. Just be my husband to take away the reproach. In that day, the branch of Yahuah shall be splendid and esteemed. So while this is happening, there is an awakening that will come about. You see, Yahuah will be esteemed. Yahusha, the branch, Yahu, our deliverer, will rise. You see, he will make himself known to his people. He will make his name known to his people. In that day, the branch of Yahuah shall be splendid and esteemed. And the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and beautiful for the escaped ones of YashaYahu, Halahu Yahuwah. So even in the midst of the chaos, Yahuwah's set apart one will be drawn out and will not fall into that nonsense. And it shall be that he who is left in Zion and he who remains in Jerusalem is called set apart, everyone who is written among the living in Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about prophecy in scripture, I haven't said this in a while, but I need to reiterate, I need to say it here again. When we study the scriptures, prophecies in scripture, Yahuwah's word is timeless. When you go to the book of Ecclesiastes and in other places, Yahuwah says that what has been what is has already been, and what will be is. Yahuwah requires that which is past. So if you want to know your future, look to your past. You see, and so history just continue to repeat itself. You see, history, life is just a cycle that continues to repeat itself, but we're so foolish that we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, generation after generation. But it's the same thing that continue to repeat itself. Now, keeping that in mind, scriptures, the prophecies of scriptures, they are both foretelling and forthtelling. They are both foretelling and forthtelling. What does that mean? When it is foretelling, it speaks of something that will happen later on down the road. Forthtelling means that it is soon to come. So the same thing that came to YashaYahu while they were in the land also comes to YashaYahu later on in captivity before our deliverance. You see, so scriptures, the prophecies of scriptures are both foretelling and forthtelling, and it's important for us to know that and to keep that in mind when we study and to apply it correctly. You see, because a lot of times when people fail to understand this and fail to apply it correctly and not recognizing history as far what is historical, what has happened and what will happen, then people also err in the scriptures in that way. But Akut, that's what context reveals. That's what context reveals. And I want to say to you for bringing up that very important question. And let me know, Akut, if you have any other questions.
Total, Archie, I did that. What you said went with my spirit, and I like these men are just saying that, to get out of being men. I was graced and to be in a two-parent family.
Yes.
So there I know what a man is or supposed to be. And my spirit does agree with you that these men that are using this scripture is out of their own lust. As I said, I don't go by what man says.
Yes.
I'd rather go by every finger that's written.
Yes, indeed.
And even the explanation that they give would be contradictory to the commandments. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbors, whatever. So I just laugh them off, or if they persist, I just remove myself. So yes, this has really confirmed what has been put into my ruach.
Praise Yahuwah.
Toda.
Praise Yahuwah. Praise Yahuwah. You're on the bar. You're welcome, Dakut. Praise Yahuwah. Well, family, what we're going to do is we're going to take our break. We're a little bit late taking break, but I enjoyed your input, and every question was important, and testimony. We give Yahuwah praise and esteem for them. We're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to go to the book of Mashali, the book of Proverbs, chapter 17. There's some important nuggets of wisdom there for us today, so I'm looking forward to us getting to that. But for now, we're going to take a break. I'm gonna go to break playing again that video that I played at the beginning. At the beginning of our fellowship today. I'm going to replay that video. Not everyone was here when I played it. I'm just going to go ahead and replay it as we prepare to go to break. So bear with me, family. Praise Father Akut Shar. Bear with me while I get that video back up on the screen, and I'll get it on as we prepare to go to break. Just give me 1 second, family. Uh-oh. Come on. All right. Oh. All right, bear with me here. Just trying to get
Okay.
this. Yes, go ahead, Aki.
Yeah, when will we return?
Oh, yes, to the in 40 minutes. It's 3:40. Let's say 3:45 now. So we'll be back at p.m. Eastern. So we'll be back at 4:25 Eastern.
Okay.
To the let's see. Let me just get this video up.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew. while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
With that, family, we're gonna prepare now to go to break, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes from now. At that point, we'll restart the live broadcast on Facebook and on YouTube. The fuse room will remain open. Shalom.